Let's talk about terrain. Every square space on the battle map represents an in-game object known as a terrain tile. There are several types of terrain, each uniquely affects movement, combat, deployment, and other special occupational conditions. Consideration of the various terrain types on the battle map is needed when making decisions on how to mobilize an army and where to best engage the enemy. The various effects provided by each terrain type can grant some units with clear advantages or disadvantages while occupied. The battle map will be set up by the players at the start of the game, but it is possible to have the various terrain tiles on the battle map change during gameplay. By default, all spaces on the battle map are plains terrain. Any terrain or settlement tile that is placed on top of a space on the battle map will override this default plains terrain type to whatever terrain type is represented by that tile. When a terrain tile is removed from the battle map, that space reverts back to the default plains terrain. There are limits to the number of units and war camps that can occupy a single terrain space. When these limits are reached, units and war camps must seek alternative spaces on the battle map to occupy. Unless it is explicitly stated otherwise, only 2 units can occupy the same battle map space, one on the ground and the other in the sky directly above it. Only 1 war camp can occupy a single ground terrain space alongside a unit. War camps cannot occupy the central square of a settlement tile or spaces occupied by other war camps. When handling unit movement or performing a war camp's move ability, players must consider the movement costs of each terrain space being moved into. Any terrain type that isn't plains or sky has the additional characteristic of being wild terrain. With regards to wild terrain, there are units in the game with a wild attribute that only dwell in the wilderness of Victoria. These wild units are not a natural deployment option for war camps or settlements. Instead, wild units are deployed from their listed wild terrain. Within the player guide, each wild terrain will list their native wild units. Wild units will also list the various wild terrain types that they can be deployed from. As long as a war camp or settlement has wild terrain within its borders, they can optionally deploy wild units associated with the targeted wild terrain type using the Deploy Wild Unit universal ability. More importantly, the universal Deploy Wild Unit ability can be performed by units as well. Because of this, wild terrain allows any unit the capability to deploy a wild unit. By leveraging wild terrain, players can more quickly build up and diversify their army composition. Deploy Wild Unit also provides a strategic element to positional battle map deployment locations. Desert, forest, mountain, river, snowland, and swamp are the 6 different wild terrain types. Deploy Wild Unit cannot target plains terrain as it is not a wild terrain type. Both the Terrain, Wild Squad Unit, and Wild Elite Unit sections of the player guide will indicate which wild units are deployable from which wild terrain types. Now I'll go over terrain movement costs. When units and war camps move along the battle map, they must consider the movement costs associated with each terrain space being moved into. All terrain movement costs are listed within the player guide terrain section. By default, each space on the battle map is a plains terrain. It costs land 1, mount 1, and aquatic 2 movement speed to move into plains terrain. Each terrain tile placed on the battle map will also list its movement costs for each of the 3 movement types. Reference these icons when handling unit or war camp movement. If any of the movement type icons, that of land, mount, or aquatic, are not present on the terrain tile, then the movement cost of 1 must be assumed. These icon associated costs can be found on each terrain type's top side piece, that is, the side without roads. The bottom side piece of a terrain tile is its road enhanced variant, which will not list any movement costs due to the road enhancement overriding its movement costs to 1. Units in war camps can only move into a terrain space if its relevant movement cost is paid. All terrain tiles placed on a battle map are also considered ground terrain. Sky terrain movement costs are the same for each of the 3 movement types. Sky terrain movement costs use the following icons. Finally, terrain movement costs can never exceed a maximum of 3. Regarding terrain occupation effects, depending on the terrain type occupied by units, they can be affected by various combat bonuses and penalties or other occupational effects. The terrain section of the player guide details each terrain's various occupational effects. These terrain effects will only affect units and cannot affect war camps or settlements. The bottom side piece of a terrain will list helpful icons that can be referenced by players looking at the battle map. These icons provide a quick reminder of the occupational effects that each terrain type provides. There are 5 categories of terrain occupation effects, each indicating the timing and conditions of how these effects are applied to units. As a side note, some units will have unique abilities that activate while that unit is occupying or interacting with certain terrain types. Additionally, terrain effects will apply to disabled units except for those terrain effects that only apply at the end of a unit's turn. Regarding attacking into, these combat bonuses and penalties are applied whenever a unit attacks into a terrain that is occupied by their targeted unit. Its icon will show one or both melee and ranged attack arrows pointing into a map. Above the arrows and map indicates whether the attacking unit will gain or lose 1 attack per turn. If melee or ranged is not specified, then the effects apply to both attack types. Regarding attacking from, these combat bonuses and penalties are applied whenever a unit from a particular terrain targets another unit. Its icons will show both melee and or ranged attack arrows pointing from a map. Above the arrows and map indicates whether the attacking unit will gain or lose 1 attack per turn. Regarding while occupying effects, as long as a unit occupies terrain with while occupying effects, its listed bonuses and penalties will remain active on that unit. When the unit no longer occupies the terrain, it is no longer affected by that unit's while occupying effects. Regarding end of turn, when a unit ends their turn, their occupied terrain's end of turn effects will trigger. These effects apply once, each time a unit ends their turn on a terrain. Because a disabled unit's turn is skipped, end of turn effects will not trigger. Units will typically heal, restock, or take damage from a terrain's end of turn effect. Healing or restocking from an end of turn effect is conditional to whether the occupying unit has the listed attribute. Like with any source of incoming damage, receiving end-of-turn terrain damage can be increased or decreased based on the occupying unit's vulnerabilities and resistances. Regarding special, this category of terrain effects is reserved for optional situations. Terrain that is enhanced with roads provides access to the universal free road movement ability for nearby units and war camps as a special effect. Units and war camps do not need to perform the free road movement if the player does not want to. Players may choose to ignore these terrain effects for their occupying unit if they have certain attributes. For example, aquatic units that occupy river or swamp terrain may ignore any of the attack into, attack from, while occupying, or end of turn terrain effects associated with their currently occupied river or swamp terrain. Ignorance of these effects can be done piecemeal. For example, the orphan beasts can ignore the vulnerability to thunder damage, but gain resistance to fire damage while occupying river terrain. Application of river or swamp terrain effects to aquatic units is optional and determined by the unit's owning and controlling player. Now let's discuss the terrain types. There are 8 types of terrain in the game. 7 ground, 1 sky. All ground terrain can be enhanced with roads. Sky terrain obviously cannot. Each type of terrain will have a unique set of wild units, movement costs, and unit occupational terrain effects. Note that only ground terrain will have 1.5 inch tiles, while sky terrain utilizes a 1 inch square game piece with clear plastic stands attached to its base and top. This creates a raised pedestal for flying units to occupy while they move onto sky terrain just above a ground. For full details on each terrain type, refer to the Player Guide Terrain section. Roads. This is a terrain enhancement that can be applied to any ground terrain by flipping its tile on the battle map to display its bottom side. Any terrain that is enhanced with roads will have all of its movement costs set to 1. The road enhanced bottom side of all terrain tiles will not list any movement costs because of this. Additionally, road enhanced terrain provides nearby units and war camps the option to perform free road movement onto its space. Flying units that are occupying the sky directly above a road enhanced terrain will also have the option to perform free road movement to land onto it. Finally, always retain roads when a ground terrain is transformed. Note that when a settlement is destroyed, the road enhancement that it provides is also removed alongside it. Plains is the default terrain type applied across all ground spaces of the battle map. Only aquatic units will have an increased movement cost for entering plains terrain. This basic terrain type provides no wild units or unit occupational terrain effects. Some abilities will transform a plains terrain into another type of ground terrain. Other abilities will transform ground terrain into a plains. Whenever this occurs, retain the roads. The default plains terrain is overridden whenever another terrain tile is placed on top of its battle map space. Regarding mountains, mountains hinder traversal by land and are very difficult for mount and aquatic movement. Within mountains, players can find a variety of large, small, and other wild units available for wild deployment. Mountains provide occupying units with a defensive advantage against any incoming attacks from units. In addition, attacks performed by units from mountains will gain a combat advantage against other units. Regarding rivers are difficult for land and mount movement, but easy for aquatic to traverse. Within rivers, players can find a variety of aquatic, bestial, and other wild units available for wild deployment. Rivers provide healing and restocking benefits for aquatic units. While occupying rivers, units will have vulnerability to thunder, but resistance to fire. Occupying units will have a disadvantage when performing melee attacks from a river against other units. Rivers are a natural environment for aquatic units. They may ignore any number of river terrain effects if they so choose. Regarding desert terrain, deserts are easily traversed by land and mount, but difficult for aquatic movement. Within deserts, players can find a variety of elemental, bestial, and other wild units available for wild deployment. While occupying deserts, units will have vulnerability to fire, resistance to ice and magic damage, and their upkeep costs will be doubled. The harsh environment of deserts will also cause occupying units to take fire damage when ending their turn on it. Swamps hinder land and are difficult for mount movement, but easily traversed by aquatic. Within swamps, players can find a variety of aquatic, bestial, plant, and other units available for wild deployment. While occupying swamps, units will have vulnerability to death and gain resistance to fire and life damage. Swamps provide occupying units with a defensive advantage against incoming ranged attacks from other units. The harsh environment of swamps will cause occupying units to take death damage when ending their turn. Swamps are a natural environment for aquatic units, and they may ignore any number of a swamp's terrain effects. As a pro tip, the death damage from swamps will heal undead units. Snowland hinders land, mount, and aquatic movement when traversing. Within Snowlands, players can find a variety of elemental, bestial, and other wild units available for wild deployment. Units occupying Snowlands will have vulnerability to ice, gain resistance to fire and magic, and their upkeep costs will be doubled. The harsh environment of Snowlands also causes occupying units to take ice damage when ending their turn. Forests are easily traversed by land, but hinders mount and aquatic movement. Within forests, players will find a variety of plant, bestial, and other wild units available for wild deployment. Forests provide healing and restocking benefits for plant units. While occupying forests, units will gain resistance to thunder damage and a defensive advantage against incoming ranged attacks from other units. Melee attacks performed by units from the forest will gain a combat advantage against other units. Finally, let's talk about the sky. Above each space on the battle map there is sky terrain. This allows for two units to occupy the same battle map space, one unit occupying the ground and the other occupies the sky directly above it. Only units with flying movement are able to move into and occupy sky terrain. It requires performing movement for a unit to move into the sky terrain, which will have them resting upon a raised sky terrain pedestal game piece. The sky pedestals are only used when a unit needs to move into and occupy sky terrain. When landed on the ground, these platforms are not needed and are set aside. Moving into the sky from the ground is hindering. Once in the sky, movement into other nearby sky terrain or landing onto the ground is easy regarding movement costs. Players will not find any wild units for wild deployment within the sky terrain as it is not a wild terrain type. Also, in general, units cannot be deployed from the sky. Sky occupying units will have a defense disadvantage against incoming ranged attacks from units. As indicated within the Player Guide's Terrain section, landing from the sky costs 1 and can be performed as a free road movement. When landing, treat the ground terrain's listed movement cost as 1 regardless of its terrain type. As a side note, some unique unit abilities require occupying or interacting with sky terrain. As a reminder, units cannot be deployed onto sky terrain, nor can they upgrade while occupying the sky.